Since ancient times, the Bible has been a book that guides, comforts, and awakens questions in those who approach its pages. But within its texts, there are secrets that few dare to mention, and today we will talk about one of them. A verse that for centuries was present in many Bibles, but which mysteriously disappeared in modern versions. This is not a simple printing error or a matter of translation, it was deliberately removed, and its absence has generated questions that almost no one dares to answer. Imagine opening your Bible, reading your favorite verses, and suddenly realizing that something that should be there simply isn't. This is what has happened with Matthew 17:21, a verse that in some older versions clearly read, "But this kind of demon can come out only by prayer and fasting." A powerful, direct message with precise instructions from Jesus on how to act in extreme spiritual situations. However, in many modern Bibles, this line has simply disappeared. Why? That's the first question that strikes us. If this verse was so important, why did someone decide to remove it? Some scholars suggest it was a matter of ancient manuscripts. Not all writings from that era have survived intact, and some texts were considered less reliable by early translators. But the Bible isn't just any book. Every word, every phrase has a purpose. And removing something as specific as this verse changes how millions interpret Jesus' teachings. What's most unsettling is that this omission hasn't been addressed from the pulpits of many churches. If you attend sermons, it's rarely mentioned. Fasting, a central practice in the spiritual life, is presented superficially or symbolically, but not as a powerful method that Jesus taught directly. This gives the verse's absence a new significance. It's not just a text that disappeared, but a message that, for unknown reasons, was silenced for centuries. The story of this lost verse extends far beyond the pages. Examine the lives of those who have tried to study, translate, and teach it. Some biblical historians discovered marginal notes in ancient documents that pointed to the importance of this phrase. But when they shared it in their communities, they encountered resistance, disbelief, or even censorship. The question that hangs in the air is simple yet chilling. What if this message had remained visible all this time? How would it change the understanding of prayer, fasting, and the spiritual power of believers? From the outset, our goal is not only to inform, but to open the eyes of those seeking to understand the depth of Jesus' message. This verse connects us to spiritual discipline and the strength that comes from faith combined with conscious action. Every word, every instruction has a hidden purpose, and removing it leaves a void that many have never noticed, but that directly affects how we live our relationship with God. The mystery begins here in the simple disappearance of a text, but it casts a shadow over centuries of interpretation. Who decided to remove it? Why was the change never explained? And more importantly, what teachings were lost when it was removed? The story we are about to unravel is not only academic but spiritual. Each discovery, each explanation, will be a piece of a puzzle that leads us to understand an aspect of the Bible that few dare to touch. To understand the disappearance of this verse, we must go back in time. The Bible, as we know it, went through centuries of handwriting, revisions, translations, and debates about the authenticity of every line. Ancient manuscripts such as the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus show that Matthew 17:21 did exist in several Greek versions. But as it was translated into Latin and then into other languages, translators began to question the authenticity of certain texts that did not appear consistently in all manuscripts. This is where the mystery deepens. Because this was not simply an academic debate, we are talking about the words of Jesus, a text that offers clear instructions on prayer and fasting to cast out demons. The omission of this line not only changes spiritual practice, but also the interpretation of how to confront evil. Many theologians argue that this decision was influenced by criteria that prioritize uniformity over the original tradition. However, others argue that there were deeper motives: control over teaching, over what was preached, and what was emphasized in the lives of believers. In some ancient manuscripts, a marginal note reads, "This verse is not found in all texts. It is omitted in some codices." A seemingly technical, almost innocuous phrase, but one that was enough for many modern translators to remove it without clear explanation. The consequence was that millions of people never read this verse as it was originally written. And here a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. While most critical verses remain intact, those containing concrete instructions for spiritual action, like this one, were removed or softened. It's not just Matthew 17:21. Other ancient passages that spoke of rituals, discipline, and strict faith practices also underwent modifications. The question that inevitably arises is, what was gained by removing these direct teachings from the spiritual experience of believers? For manuscript experts, the mystery is both fascinating and unsettling. Some argue that these omissions reflect the difficulty of maintaining a consistent Bible through centuries of translations and copies. But if we look at the overall pattern, we see that the disappearance of certain verses is not random. It affects messages of power, discipline, and spiritual action. Each deleted line reduces the practical impact of the teaching, leaving the reader with more abstract concepts and fewer tools to deal with real spiritual situations. The story of the missing verse is also intertwined with resistance. Those who tried to explain it were criticized, ignored, or discredited. The lack of consensus about its significance led many to remain silent. But silence doesn't mean the message disappears. On the contrary, silence increases curiosity, sparks questions, and creates a sense that there is a closely guarded secret, knowledge possessed by few that could transform how we understand the Bible. Thus, the disappearance of this verse is not merely a historical fact. It is a reminder that every word in the Bible carries weight and that every omission can change the way millions of people experience their faith. The silence surrounding this text has become a mystery that few dare to investigate, but which we will explore in depth. As we delve deeper into the story of the deleted verse, an even more unsettling question arises: what real impact did this message have on the spiritual lives of believers? Matthew 17:21 wasn't a symbolic phrase or a poetic metaphor. It was a direct instruction from Jesus, a revelation that connected spiritual power with two specific practices: prayer and fasting. And that detail changes everything. Jesus didn't speak randomly. Every time he taught, he was responding to a concrete need. In this passage, the disciples had tried to cast out a demon and had failed. Confused, they asked why they hadn't succeeded. Jesus' answer was clear and forceful. There were spiritual levels that couldn't be addressed with words alone, but rather with a spiritually disciplined life. Fasting wasn't optional. It was part of the process. This is where the message begins to unsettle, because fasting involves sacrifice, self-denial, time, silence, and discipline. It's not a comfortable or popular practice. Over the centuries, many Christian communities have abandoned this practice, focusing more on messages of comfort than on calls for profound transformation. Removing the verse not only took away a phrase from the Bible, but also softened a demanding teaching. When we look at modern Bible versions that omit Matthew 17-21, we notice that the message still exists in fragmented form in other passages. Jesus spoke of fasting on several occasions, but this verse was unique because it directly connected it to spiritual authority. Without it, the narrative is incomplete. The link between active faith and deep spiritual preparation is lost. Some theologians have tried to minimize its importance, saying that the message is implied in other texts. But implicit is not the same as explicit. When Jesus said, "This man comes out only by prayer and fasting," he was revealing a spiritual hierarchy, an invisible reality that requires more than superficial faith. Removing that phrase reduces the intensity of the message and changes the way spiritual warfare is taught. What is most unsettling is that in practice, this omission has had real consequences. Entire generations grew up without hearing this direct call to fasting as a spiritual tool. Many believers face difficult situations without understanding why their prayers seem to go unanswered. The message that could have provided clarity and direction was relegated to silence. This is not an attack on modern translations nor a conspiracy theory. It is an invitation to reflect. Because when such a direct teaching is lost, part of the spiritual responsibility that Jesus taught is also lost. The verse was not removed by accident. It was discarded based on human criteria. And when human criteria decide which words remain and which disappear, the original message is inevitably diluted. The mystery of the missing verse lies not only in its absence, but in what it reveals about us. We prefer easy, quick, and convenient messages. But Jesus never promised comfort. He promised truth, transformation, and spiritual power, at a cost. Now that we know the story, the final question isn't whether the verse was removed, but what we do with that information. Because even though Matthew 17:21 doesn't appear in some modern Bibles, its message remains alive. It cannot be erased from the heart of Jesus' teachings. Fasting and prayer aren't outdated practices without relevance. They are spiritual keys that still work today. The Bible isn't just a book to read, but a guide for living. When we discover that certain texts were omitted, we aren't called to distrust, but to delve deeper, to seek, to investigate, to not settle for a superficial faith. Jesus always invited us to go further, to dig deep, to build on the rock and not on the sand. The missing verse then becomes a symbol, a reminder that there are truths that aren't always obvious. Some require effort, study, and courage to understand. Authentic faith doesn't shy away from difficult questions. It faces them with humility and reverence. Today, more than ever, the message of Matthew 17:21 resonates. We live in times of confusion, anxiety, and constant spiritual struggle. Many seek quick answers but ignore the spiritual disciplines that strengthen the soul. Jesus didn't offer magic formulas. He offered a path, constant prayer, conscious fasting, and a deep relationship with God. The fact that this verse has been omitted from some versions doesn't mean it has lost its power. On the contrary, its rediscovery awakens a new generation of believers who aren't satisfied with the superficial faith people who understand that spiritual growth requires commitment, sacrifice, and obedience. Perhaps the real problem was never the verse itself. Perhaps the problem is that its message demands too much. It demands time, focus, and dedication. And in a world that never stops moving, that kind of message is uncomfortable. But Jesus never sought comfortable followers. He sought willing hearts. In the end, the question isn't why this verse was removed, but why it continues to be uncomfortable today. The answer lies within each of us. The message is still there, waiting to be experienced, because some truths cannot be erased, only ignored or rediscovered.